Hi, welcome to the first short lecture on Chapter 2. I'd like to review three things in this lecture: tone, satiric poetry, and persona. And once again, I've brought the definitions up here. If you've already read the chapter and taken the vocabulary quiz, then you're familiar with these, but I'd like to keep them in our minds as we're looking at the sample poems. So let's start with tone, the mood or manner of expression in a literary work, which conveys an attitude toward the work's subject, maybe playful, sarcastic, ironic, sad, solemn, or any other possible attitude. So already we know that there are so many different types of tone to choose from, it might sometimes be difficult to be entirely sure what the tone is. So we're going to work in this chapter on how to figure that out. Working with tone helps to establish the reader's relationship to the characters or ideas that are presented in the work. All right, so a great poem to look at when we're thinking about tone is My Papa's Waltz by Theodor Rutke. Rutke had been, in the 20th century, a professor at the University of Washington. My Papa's Waltz. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We stomped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. When you read this poem, you may have noticed certain things about it. For example, there's a humor to the poem. The idea of the father and son dancing together and making such a racket and stomping so much that the pans are falling off the kitchen shelf and the mother's frowning at this activity and the mess it's creating. You might have laughed a little bit at the thought of the child trying to keep up with the father's steps and the father beating the time on the child's head as he waltzes him off to bed. At the same time, you might have noticed things like the father's drunkenness, the whiskey on his breath, and the fact that that was making the boy dizzy just as the dancing might have been. That the child hung on like death, that such waltzing was not easy. The mother's frowning, the child's ear scraping the buckle each time the drunken father missed a step, and then this really poignant image of the child clinging to the father's shirt as he's being waltzed off to bed. So what do we do with that? How do we determine the tone in this poem? We have to sort through those details and decide, from this perspective, is the humor more prevalent? Is the possible critique of the father more prevalent? Is it a mixture of these two things? And so if you look in the textbook on page 20, our authors offer some possibilities. They note that most readers find that this is a critical yet affectionate view of the father from the child's perspective, and the textual evidence seems to support that. Overreading the critique of the father might reduce our ability to recognize what's comic in this poem. And the authors point out that it's not just the imagery and the information, but even the rhyming that takes place that suggests, with things like head and bed, dirt and shirt, that there is a comic aspect. And so they determine that the tone remains grotesquely comic, which is an interesting phrase. In the literature of the grotesque, there's an emphasis on the body, a distorted emphasis. I don't think they mean the literature of the grotesque here. I think they simply mean that the humor is somewhat distorted and there's a slight ugliness to it, and yet the humor is still there. So one of the things you'll want to do with the other poems in the chapter is read through and try to determine what the tone is for each of those poems. And I will note that your take on the tone may change sometimes the more often you read the poem. This may have even happened when you were memorizing your haiku for week 1, and perhaps the tone you felt in that poem changed the more often you recalled it and the more often you read it. And so that's why it's really worthwhile to keep reading through these poems and thinking about, who's speaking. We talked before last week about not assuming it's the poet, but that there's a speaker to the poem. So who's speaking? What information are they trying to convey? Do they have an attitude toward the subject matter they want us to relate to? So start asking those kinds of questions and then see if you can determine the tone in the other poems in the chapter. All right, let's move on to satiric poetry. And there's a great example in our book by County Cullen. County Cullen was a Harlem Renaissance poet. The Harlem Renaissance was a really vibrant, exciting movement in New York in the 1920s. It was an intellectual, artistic, creative movement, and I've included under recommended resources in this week's Moodle block a link to more information about the Harlem Renaissance that I encourage you to check out. But here we're looking at Cullen's short poem as an example of satiric poetry, right? So poetry that blends criticism with humor to convey a message, usually through the use of irony and a tone of detached amusement, withering contempt, and implied superiority. For a lady I know, she even thinks that up in heaven her class lies late and snores, while poor black cherubs rise at 7 to do celestial chores. I think it becomes pretty clear in this 4-line poem that the lady being critiqued has socioeconomic and racial privilege, and she is so secure in her privilege that she assumes the privilege she enjoys on earth will also be afforded to her in the Christian heaven. And so the critique that comes in the poem is that contrast between a Christian view of heaven and the inequality that's taking place on earth based on money and race. So we as readers are encouraged, again, through the rhyme, heaven, 7, snores, chores, that end rhyme, just as we saw in My Papa's Waltz, we're encouraged to find some humor here. And I think detached amusement, as we see in the definition, is appropriate. And then we're also encouraged to feel some contempt for the person who is the subject or victim of the critique, right? That's one of the things the textbook talks about, that there's an implication the reader too ought to feel contempt for the victim. And I think that Cullen, in this case, is using humor, pointed humor, to encourage the reader to not identify with the lady, but to critique the lady and therefore critique the privilege that she's enjoying. The final concept I want to think about in this first lecture is persona. And just as tone itself has so many variations, so many options, persona works in the same way. It's simply a fictitious character that's created by the author. So the speaker is a fictitious character. This may remind you of dramatic monologue that we reviewed in chapter 1. And in the book, you'll see a number of examples. You may have a persona, say in Robinson's Luke Havergal, who's mysterious, a little hard to pin down. Who is this voice coming from out of the grave to advise Luke Havergal? And should Luke Havergal follow this advice to go to the Western Gate? And that mystery makes it a little harder to determine whether that Western Gate, possibly representing the end of life, passage to death, is something that Luke Havergal should pursue at that moment or not, right? So you have to think about the persona. And that range continues beyond just a mysterious persona to Ted Hughes' hawk, or even Kim's onion. Even an onion can be the persona in a poem. And so for those of you who write poetry, I wonder if you have been experimenting with using different personas for the speakers in your poems, and if you haven't, maybe to give that a try. And for those of you who don't write poetry but are readers of poetry, to enjoy the challenge of analyzing the persona. Why is it important that in Luke Havergal, that persona, that mystery voice is coming from out of the grave? Why is it important with Kim's onion that there's a peeling away of layers, that if we're supposed to learn something about the human condition and the human heart, that the onion is something that typically makes us cry? So posing those kinds of questions, along with the other questions we've mentioned for determining tone, will definitely help you have a richer experience of the poems that we're reading.